The lecture hall was enormous, with rows of seats stretching high and wide. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the polished wooden floors and the dark green chalkboards that covered the walls. Students filled the seats, notebooks and laptops open, waiting for the professor to begin. There was a sense of excitement in the air, but also tension. Today, Professor Whitman had promised to present a problem that no one had solved yet, something he called impossible. Some students whispered quietly to each other, speculating what the challenge could be. Many thought it would be beyond their reach, even beyond their imagination. At the front of the room, the professor adjusted his glasses and leaned slightly on the podium. His voice was calm but carried authority as he began to speak. He explained the rules of the problem carefully, pointing to diagrams on the board, moving from one formula to the next. His handwriting was precise, neat, and his explanation clear. He described why this problem had resisted every attempt for decades. The complexity of the patterns and the level of reasoning required were beyond most undergraduate minds. Students scribbled notes frantically, trying to keep up with every detail. Among the audience, there was someone very different. A young girl of 12 sat quietly in the middle of the hall, her legs swinging slightly above the floor. She had come with an older relative who was studying at the university, but she had insisted on sitting in the lecture hall. While the older students whispered and nudged each other, she sat with wide eyes, absorbing every word. She didn't fully understand everything, but she was curious, and curiosity had a way of guiding her where knowledge had yet to reach. The professor paused to draw a particularly complex diagram, explaining each step with deliberate care. He spoke of abstract ideas, relationships between numbers, and hidden connections that even advanced students struggled to see. Many heads tilted, brows furrowed, some students shaking their heads in silent frustration. They felt the weight of the challenge pressing down on them, realizing that the professor might actually be right. This could truly be impossible. Some took deep breaths, others leaned back in their chairs, trying to follow along without losing their focus. The young girl, however, leaned forward, her eyes tracing every line the professor drew, her mind moving in its own way. She asked herself questions quietly, sometimes jotting a small note on a piece of paper she had brought along. She didn't need to impress anyone. She just wanted to understand. And somehow, the complexity that seemed overwhelming to others felt like a puzzle waiting to be explored. Every time the professor said something about the problem's limitations, she thought of possibilities, of paths no one else was considering. Time passed, and the lecture hall became almost silent except for the sound of pens scratching on paper. The professor spoke about previous attempts to solve the problem, listing famous mathematicians and their failures. He emphasized that even the brightest minds had come up empty-handed. Students nodded, some taking this as a warning to stop trying, to accept the impossible. But the young girl's mind refused to give up. The impossibility he spoke of felt more like a challenge to her, a call to think differently, to look closer, to not be intimidated by reputation or experience. As the professor continued, he moved through a series of examples, demonstrating why traditional methods would never work. The audience watched, some in awe, others with frustration creeping in. A few students whispered to each other, doubting whether they could even attempt it. The young girl, however, noticed patterns that others ignored. Tiny connections, subtle hints in the examples, small inconsistencies that sparked ideas in her mind. She wasn't sure what they meant yet, but a seed of possibility had been planted. The lecture was long, almost exhausting for those who had expected something simpler. The professor's words were heavy with authority, his gestures precise, as if every movement underscored the impossibility of the task. He concluded with a final statement, declaring that this problem had defeated experts for years, and he doubted anyone in the room would find a solution. The hall was quiet, the weight of his declaration settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. Some students slumped in their seats, resigned, already thinking of other tasks and assignments. But the young girl did not feel defeated. She sat straight, her hands folded on her lap, eyes bright with determination. Where others saw a wall, she saw a door slightly ajar. Where the professor saw boundaries, she imagined paths that might not follow the usual rules. She didn't speak yet, didn't raise her hand, but her mind was already working, turning over possibilities, imagining scenarios, asking questions that hadn't even been voiced. When the lecture finally ended, the students began packing their things, talking quietly about the impossibility of what they had just witnessed. Some joked about how no one would ever solve it, while others shook their heads in disbelief at the complexity. The professor gathered his notes, speaking briefly with a few graduate students before preparing to leave. The young girl remained seated, not moving. She looked at the problem one more time in her notebook, tracing her thoughts carefully, feeling a strange mixture of excitement and challenge. Her presence did not go unnoticed. A few students glanced at her curiously, wondering how she could even understand what had just been presented. One whispered, pointing discreetly, asking if she had understood any of it. She just smiled slightly, keeping her focus on her own thoughts. She didn't need approval. She needed discovery. In that moment, she felt something unusual, a sense that she might see something that others hadn't, that she might glimpse a possibility hidden in plain sight. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting warm light across the campus. The hall slowly emptied, leaving echoes of the lecture behind. The young girl finally stood, clutching her notebook tightly. She knew she couldn't share her ideas just yet. She needed to think, to experiment, to test her mind against the impossible problem. But deep down, a small flame of confidence burned. She had felt it, the first spark that maybe, just maybe, the impossible could be approached differently. That day marked the beginning of something extraordinary. While the professor had declared defeat and most students had accepted it, one small visitor had not. Her curiosity, courage, and refusal to accept limits set the stage for what was to come. And though no one yet realized it, the classroom that day was about to witness something unforgettable, a moment that would challenge the expectations of everyone present. The next day, the lecture hall was buzzing again, though this time the atmosphere was different. Students who had been quiet the day before now spoke in hushed tones about the impossible problem. Some were eager to try it again. Others were still shaking their heads, convinced it could not be solved. The young girl walked into the hall, notebook in hand, her heart pounding with anticipation. She felt a mix of nerves and excitement, as if she were about to step into uncharted territory. Today was not just about listening. She wanted to explore. She found a seat in the middle, the same spot as yesterday, and set her notebook on her lap. Around her, students whispered and scribbled notes, some trying to compare answers and ideas. The professor had returned as well, standing tall at the front of the room, radiating confidence. He seemed unaware that someone so young was sitting among the audience, that one small observer might soon challenge his ideas. He began the lecture by reviewing the problem again, emphasizing its difficulty, showing once more why it had baffled even the most brilliant minds. Students listened intently, some frustrated, others impressed, but all were aware that the stakes had been set high. The young girl followed every word, her mind active, connecting the dots in ways that were different from the others. She didn't rely on memorized formulas or previous attempts. She used her imagination, her ability to look at things from unusual angles. The professor asked questions during the lecture, prompting students to think, but most struggled. Some whispered answers to each other, trying to make sense of it together. The young girl, however, wrote quietly in her notebook, jotting ideas, sketching diagrams, circling thoughts, testing possibilities that no one else considered. When the lecture was nearly over, the professor paused and said that he would now take questions. Students shuffled uncomfortably. Usually, questions came from graduate students eager to clarify, but today there was hesitation. The problem was known to be unsolvable, and no one wanted to embarrass themselves. A few hands went up, then lowered. The room fell into silence, the only sound the scratching of pens as people copied down the professor's final words. The young girl raised her hand slowly. At first no one noticed, but then a ripple of murmurs passed through the hall. A 12-year-old? Raising a hand at Harvard to challenge the impossible? Eyes turned, some curious, some doubtful. The professor glanced at her, surprised. He adjusted his glasses and frowned slightly. Not used to seeing someone so young in his lecture hall, much less someone with the courage to raise a hand. For a moment he hesitated, perhaps wondering if this was a joke or a misunderstanding, but then he nodded toward her, inviting her to speak. She stood up carefully, her hands holding her notebook tightly. Her voice was soft at first, but steady. She asked a question that cut straight to the heart of the problem. Her words were precise and thoughtful, showing that she had been thinking deeply about what had been presented. The students in the room exchanged astonished glances. some leaning forward in their seats, unable to believe what they were hearing. The professor paused, blinking, clearly caught off guard. This was not the usual question from a graduate student. This was something entirely different. As she continued, she outlined her reasoning carefully, explaining how she had considered the problem from a new angle. She didn't claim she had the full solution, but she offered a perspective that challenged the assumptions everyone had accepted. The professor's expression shifted from surprise to intrigue. He asked her to clarify, prompting her to give examples and walk through her thought process. The young girl responded with calm confidence, using simple illustrations, connecting points logically, showing that she had truly been thinking independently. The students around her were silent. Some whispered to each other, expressing disbelief. Others watched in awe. This was no ordinary question. It was a spark, a challenge that demanded attention. The professor, who had declared the problem impossible just the day before, leaned back slightly, studying her carefully. He realized that her approach, while unconventional, was meaningful. She was not just asking for clarification. She was presenting an idea that could potentially open a new path. For a few minutes, the room was suspended in a strange tension. The young girl continued to explain her line of thinking, her hands moving as she pointed to the diagrams and sketches she had drawn. She spoke of patterns that had been overlooked, connections that were subtle but significant. Her words were simple yet precise, carrying the weight of a mind that refused to be confined by the limits imposed by others. The professor nodded slowly, more to himself than to her, acknowledging that there was merit in her perspective. Some students began to whisper excitedly, realizing that what was happening was extraordinary. They had expected a routine lecture and perhaps some minor questions, but instead, they were witnessing the first moment of challenge to the so-called impossible. Even those who had doubted her ability could not ignore the clarity and originality of her thought. She had captured the attention of everyone in the room without arrogance or exaggeration, relying solely on her curiosity and reasoning. After the lecture ended, the professor stayed behind, asking her to come forward and discuss her ideas further. The young girl approached carefully, her notebook clutched to her chest. They spoke quietly, the conversation filled with encouragement, questions, and clarification. She showed him her diagrams, explained the connections she had noticed, and he listened intently, occasionally jotting notes himself. This was a moment neither of them would forget. The young girl was no longer just an observer. She had become an active participant in the world of ideas that had seemed unreachable to her age group. Outside the lecture hall, students talked in clusters, still buzzing with disbelief and excitement. Some approached her to ask how she had thought of her questions, while others speculated on the potential impact of her ideas. The young girl listened politely, offering small smiles but keeping her focus on the problem itself. She was not interested in fame or attention. She wanted to understand, to explore, and to see how far her thinking could go. The day continued with her returning to her seat, jotting more ideas, and observing how others tried to engage with the problem. She noticed that even small suggestions from students or the professor gave her new insights. Her mind was like a sponge, absorbing, testing, and reshaping every thought. She could see connections that others overlooked, subtle patterns that seemed invisible to more experienced eyes. The excitement of discovery coursed through her, fueling her determination to continue. As the sun set and the lecture hall emptied, the young girl lingered, her notebook open, reviewing every line, every idea. She felt a sense of accomplishment but also anticipation. She knew that this was only the beginning. The problem was still unsolved, but the first step had been taken. The spark had been ignited and she had raised her hand to light it. That small act, simple yet brave, had shifted something in the room. The impossible was no longer absolute, and for the first time, others began to wonder if perhaps it could be approached differently. That evening, as she walked across the campus, notebook in hand, the cool air brushing her face, she felt a quiet confidence. The world of ideas was vast and challenging, but she had taken her first step into it, not as a passive observer, but as someone willing to question, to explore, and to imagine. And though she did not yet know the outcome, she understood something important. The courage to raise your hand, to ask questions, and to think differently was the true beginning of discovery. The day after the young girl had raised her hand, the lecture hall felt charged with energy. Word had spread quickly among the students about what had happened, and many returned with curiosity and a bit of skepticism. They wanted to see if the idea that had come from a 12-year-old could actually hold any weight. The professor, too, had been thinking about the question she had asked. His curiosity had been piqued in a way that rarely happened. He was a man accustomed to brilliance, to complex reasoning, yet something about her perspective had made him pause and reconsider. As the lecture began, the professor reviewed the problem once more. He spoke with the same authority, but his tone carried a hint of openness this time. Students listened carefully, some exchanging glances, wondering if they would witness something extraordinary again. The young girl sat quietly in her seat, notebook in hand, ready to contribute if asked. Her mind was still buzzing with ideas from the previous day. She had spent hours thinking about the problem, analyzing it in new ways and testing possibilities. She was eager, but also patient, knowing that the right moment to speak might not come immediately. The professor asked a few students to explain what they understood from yesterday's lecture. Some stumbled, repeating points mechanically. Others hesitated, unsure of how to approach the problem. The young girl listened carefully, noticing the gaps in understanding, the small areas where assumptions were being made without proof. She made small notes in her notebook, her mind organizing the information in a way that helped her see patterns that were hidden from the others. Finally, the professor looked directly at her and asked if she wanted to elaborate on her question from yesterday. She nodded and stood slowly, her hands gripping her notebook. The room grew silent. All eyes were on her, and the tension was almost tangible. She began speaking softly but clearly, walking everyone through her line of thinking. She referred to the notes she had made, showing how each step connected to the next, highlighting patterns and possibilities that others had overlooked. The professor's brow furrowed in concentration, a sign that he was genuinely engaged. As she spoke, the students began to whisper, their voices filled with surprise and curiosity. Her explanation was not complicated for the sake of being complex. It was simple, logical, and creative. She challenged assumptions, not with arrogance but with genuine curiosity. She suggested ways to test certain parts of the problem, pointing out that a small change in perspective could reveal something previously hidden. Some of the graduate students who had been struggling now leaned forward, taking notes and nodding as if a light had been switched on. The professor asked her to give an example. She quickly sketched a diagram on the board, walking the room through each step. The connections became clearer as she explained, and even those who had doubted her began to see the value in her reasoning. Her approach was not traditional, but it worked. She had taken the impossible problem and broken it down in a way that was fresh, imaginative, and logical. The atmosphere in the room shifted. There was excitement, a sense of discovery, and the quiet thrill of witnessing something unprecedented. She continued explaining how her idea could be tested further. She suggested small experiments, little steps that could confirm whether her perspective held true. The professor listened carefully, asking questions that challenged her reasoning, pushing her to clarify each point. She responded with confidence and precision, adjusting her explanations to address his queries. Every word she spoke demonstrated that she was not only thinking critically, but also capable of adapting her ideas under scrutiny. It became clear that her mind was capable of rigorous thought, far beyond what anyone had anticipated from a child of her age. The students watched, captivated. Some of them, who had come with the idea that the problem was unsolvable, now felt a spark of hope. They began to discuss her approach quietly among themselves, realizing that her perspective offered a real path forward. It was a moment that changed the energy in the room. The impossible was no longer a wall but a challenge that could be approached in a new way. Her courage, intelligence, and clarity of thought were contagious, inspiring even those who had been skeptical to reconsider what might be possible. The professor called a brief break to discuss her ideas privately. They stepped to the side of the room, speaking quietly but intensely. He asked how she had come up with her approach, curious about the thought process behind it. She explained that she had simply tried to look at the problem differently, not relying on what others had done, but thinking about what the problem itself might be trying to reveal. Her insight, though simple, was profound. The professor nodded slowly, impressed by her ability to combine intuition, logic, and creativity in a single coherent approach. When they returned to the lecture, The professor spoke to the students about her ideas without naming her. He outlined her approach, showing how it provided a new perspective on the problem. The room was abuzz with questions, excitement, and careful consideration. The students tried to follow the steps she had outlined, testing her logic and seeing how it fit with what they already knew. Some struggled, but most were intrigued. For the first time, the impossible problem felt like a challenge that could be approached rather than an insurmountable barrier. The young girl returned to her seat, her mind racing with further possibilities. She continued to make notes, exploring how her approach might be refined or extended. She noticed patterns in the students' attempts to follow her reasoning and began thinking of ways to guide them without taking control. Her focus was on discovery, not recognition, and that humility gave her clarity. She understood that ideas needed space to grow, and she was patient in letting them develop even as excitement surrounded her. By the end of the day, the professor gathered everyone together. He praised the collective effort and acknowledged the fresh perspective that had shifted the discussion. While he did not claim that the problem was solved, he made it clear that the approach presented by the young girl had opened new doors, revealing paths that had been hidden from view. The students left the lecture hall inspired, talking animatedly about the possibilities. The young girl walked with quiet satisfaction, knowing she had contributed something meaningful, but already thinking about the next steps. Outside, the campus seemed brighter, filled with energy and conversation. Students speculated about what might happen next, eager to explore further. The young girl walked slowly, notebook in hand, reviewing every detail. She knew the journey was far from over, but she had taken a significant step. The spark had been lit, and the impossible problem was no longer untouchable. The thought that a child could influence the thinking at one of the world's most prestigious universities was astonishing, but she never thought of it that way. For her, it was simply the joy of discovery, the thrill of asking questions and the satisfaction of thinking in ways that others had overlooked. That evening, she found a quiet spot in a library corner and began testing her ideas further. The diagrams, notes, and patterns she had identified earlier were carefully examined and refined. Every new insight, every small connection fueled her determination. She felt alive with curiosity and possibility, knowing that even though the path was challenging, she had already changed the way people thought about the problem. She understood that true discovery required patience, persistence, and courage, and she was ready to continue. This was only the beginning, and she felt certain that the story of the impossible problem would never be the same again. The next morning, the young girl arrived early at the lecture hall. The air was filled with anticipation, as students who had heard about her question and ideas were eager to see what would happen next. Some had come prepared with notebooks and pens, hoping to follow the fresh perspective she had introduced. The professor was already there, arranging his materials and looking thoughtful. He had spent the night reviewing her approach, testing it against different scenarios, and now he was ready to explore it further with the class. When the lecture began, the professor started by summarizing the previous sessions, highlighting the problem and the new perspective that had been introduced. He acknowledged the young girl's contribution, emphasizing how her question had challenged assumptions and opened a new path for investigation. Students listened attentively, the excitement in the room palpable. Some whispered to their neighbors, discussing the possibilities and trying to imagine what the next steps might be. The young girl sat quietly, her notebook open, as the professor began to analyze her ideas more systematically. He invited her to come forward and help guide the discussion. She stood, a mixture of nervousness and determination in her posture. Her voice was calm and steady as she walked the class through her approach again, but this time in more detail. She explained each connection, each small step that she had considered, and how it led to a new understanding of the problem. Her explanation was simple yet precise, making complex ideas feel accessible without losing their depth. Students were captivated. They asked questions and she answered thoughtfully, sometimes pausing to think, sometimes sketching small diagrams to clarify her points. She never acted as if she knew everything. Instead, she invited the class to explore with her. The professor observed closely, nodding occasionally, clearly impressed with her ability to communicate and reason. Her perspective was changing the dynamic of the class. What had seemed impossible was now something tangible, something that could be approached, discussed, and tested. As the session continued, the professor asked her to propose a method for testing her ideas. She suggested a series of small experiments and step-by-step logical checks, explaining how each step would help validate her reasoning. The students began to follow her instructions, carefully working through the steps and seeing that her approach held merit. Some of the graduate students who had initially doubted her were now fully engaged, taking notes, asking questions, and even suggesting small refinements. The room was filled with collaboration, the energy of discovery, and the excitement of witnessing something new. After several hours of discussion, testing, and analysis, it became clear that her approach was not just a theory. It produced results that aligned with what the professor had expected from decades of research, but with a clarity and simplicity that had never been seen before. The impossible problem was no longer an unsolvable wall. It had become a path of exploration. The young girl had not only contributed to the solution, but had also inspired a shift in how everyone approached complex challenges. The professor called a brief pause, gathering the students together to reflect on the progress. He praised the collaborative effort, emphasizing the importance of curiosity, persistence, and openness to new ideas. He noted that while the problem was still complex, the fresh perspective introduced by the young girl had opened possibilities that could be explored further. The students left the lecture hall energized, discussing what they had learned and excited to continue their experiments and observations. The young girl, however, did not leave immediately. She stayed behind, reviewing the results and jotting additional notes. She noticed subtle patterns in the data, small details that could provide further insight. Her mind was relentless, exploring every angle, considering every possibility. She spoke quietly with the professor, discussing refinements, asking questions, and suggesting adjustments. He listened carefully, asking her to explain her thought process, and they worked together to analyze the next steps. Over the next few days, the classroom became a hub of activity. Students collaborated more openly, sharing ideas, testing hypotheses, and exploring variations of her approach. The professor guided the discussions but allowed the young girl's perspective to shape the direction of inquiry. Each day, more progress was made, more patterns discovered, and the sense of possibility grew. The once impossible problem was now a living experiment, evolving with every discussion and test. As the experiments progressed, news of the young girl's contribution spread beyond the classroom. Other professors and researchers became aware of her ideas and began following the developments. Invitations to discuss her approach, to collaborate, and to share insights arrived. She was recognized not for her age but for her curiosity, her reasoning, and her ability to see what others had missed. The classroom was transformed into a space where ideas mattered more than experience, and where the courage to ask questions could lead to discoveries that no one had anticipated. The young girl continued to work tirelessly, often staying late to review data, make new notes, and think through challenges. She understood that true discovery required patience and persistence, and she embraced both. The professor occasionally joined her, discussing refinements and exploring further possibilities. Together, they tested ideas, confirmed patterns, and documented results. The process was slow and careful, but each step brought clarity and the sense of achievement grew. Even after the impossible problem had been approached and partially solved, the young girl's curiosity did not rest. She had tasted the thrill of discovery, and it fueled her determination to explore even further. Each day she returned to the university, notebook in hand, eager to think about new challenges, refine previous ideas, and push the boundaries of her own understanding. While some students had been content to watch the progress unfold, she continued to dive deep, analyzing every detail, testing assumptions, and imagining new possibilities. The professor, who had first declared the problem impossible, now looked at her with admiration and renewed respect. He encouraged her to explore beyond the initial solution, to see what else might be uncovered. Together, they began tackling related questions and extensions of the problem, exploring aspects that even experienced researchers had overlooked. Their discussions were intense yet collaborative, full of careful reasoning, thoughtful questions, and moments of revelation. The young girl's insight continued to shine, revealing patterns and ideas that opened doors to further understanding. Students in the lecture hall noticed the change in dynamics. What had once been a place of tension and fear of the impossible had become a space of active exploration and collaborative thinking. They began to participate more freely, inspired by the young girl's courage and clarity. They asked questions without hesitation, shared observations, and tested hypotheses in ways that had seemed intimidating before. Her presence reminded them that ideas were more important than age, curiosity more powerful than experience, and creativity more impactful than rigid adherence to tradition. As she continued her work, she documented her discoveries meticulously. Each note, sketch, and diagram captured not only the solution, but the thought process behind it. Her notebook became a map of exploration, showing how ideas evolved, how dead ends led to new paths, and how even small observations could spark significant breakthroughs. She reviewed these notes regularly, constantly seeking connections and insights, refining her understanding, and preparing to test new possibilities. Every detail mattered to her, and she treated each challenge as an opportunity to learn and grow. The professor and other researchers began inviting her to collaborate on related projects. They recognized that her unique perspective could illuminate areas that conventional approaches had ignored. She worked alongside experts, contributing ideas, asking critical questions, and offering fresh approaches. Her contributions were always thoughtful, carefully considered, and grounded in logic, yet infused with creativity and intuition. She became a bridge between youthful curiosity and professional rigor, showing that innovation often comes from seeing the familiar in new ways. The young girl also began mentoring other students, encouraging them to think differently and approach problems with an open mind. She shared her strategies for observation, analysis, and exploration, emphasizing patience, curiosity, and persistence. Her approach was not about simply giving answers, but about teaching others to ask the right questions and to see connections that were not immediately obvious. Students responded eagerly, inspired by her humility and determination, and gradually the culture of the classroom shifted to one where every voice, no matter the age or experience, could contribute meaningfully. Outside the lecture halls and laboratories, the young girl explored problems in everyday life as well. She observed patterns in nature, considered how small changes could have significant effects, and experimented with ideas that blended mathematics, logic, and creativity. Her curiosity was boundless. Whether she was studying the flow of water, the way light reflected on surfaces, or the patterns in a simple puzzle, she applied the same careful thinking and imagination she had used in the impossible problem. Each exploration added to her understanding and fed her growing sense of possibility. As the months passed, the young girl began to understand the broader impact of her work. She realized that solving complex problems was not just about reaching answers, but about cultivating a mindset of inquiry, observation, and courage. She recognized that asking questions that others might dismiss, exploring avenues that seemed unlikely, and thinking freely could lead to discoveries that transformed understanding. She took these lessons to heart, applying them in every area of learning, and inspiring others to do the same. The university began to celebrate the culture of curiosity and exploration that had emerged. Workshops, seminars, and collaborative projects welcomed students of all ages and backgrounds, emphasizing creativity, critical thinking, and the courage to challenge assumptions. The young girl's story became central to this cultural shift, a living example of how curiosity, persistence, and careful reasoning could overcome even the most daunting challenges. Her approach showed that intelligence was not defined by age, and that innovation often came from fresh perspectives. The young girl continued to tackle increasingly complex questions. Each new problem offered opportunities to test her reasoning, explore possibilities, and refine her understanding. She approached each one with patience and determination, understanding that breakthroughs rarely came instantly, but through careful thought, experimentation, and iteration. Her curiosity remained insatiable, driving her forward into new areas of study and exploration. Alongside her academic pursuits, she maintained a sense of balance and reflection. She spent time walking across campus, observing her surroundings, thinking deeply about ideas, and considering how her discoveries connected to the larger world. These moments of quiet contemplation helped her synthesize knowledge, generate new insights, and approach challenges with clarity. She understood that true learning required both active engagement and thoughtful reflection, and she cultivated both consistently. The impact of her work continued to ripple outward. Students, researchers, and faculty members all learned from her approach, adopting her methods of careful observation, creative thinking, and persistent inquiry. The university became a place where innovation thrived, where new ideas were welcomed, and where curiosity was celebrated. The young girl's influence extended far beyond her own discoveries, shaping the way knowledge was pursued and shared. As she grew older, her experiences with the impossible problem became a foundation for a lifelong approach to learning and discovery. She understood that challenges were opportunities, that failure was a stepping stone to insight, and that the courage to question and explore was more valuable than any immediate answer. Her journey demonstrated that brilliance was not a fixed trait, but a combination of curiosity, courage, persistence, and imagination. She had learned to see possibilities where others saw limits, to find connections where others saw confusion, and to create understanding where others saw only complexity. The young girl's journey with the impossible problem continued to inspire those around her. Her story showed that breakthroughs often come from unexpected sources, that age and experience are not the only measures of ability, and that determination and curiosity can open doors that others believe are closed. She became a symbol of possibility, demonstrating that anyone who is willing to think differently, ask questions, and explore creatively can make a meaningful impact on the world. Walking across the campus one evening, notebook in hand, she reflected on how far she had come. The impossible problem that once seemed insurmountable had become a path of exploration, learning, and discovery. She smiled, thinking about the countless questions that still awaited her curiosity and imagination. She understood that the journey of discovery was endless, filled with challenges, surprises, and moments of insight. And as she looked ahead, she felt ready for whatever came next, knowing that the spark of curiosity and courage that had started it all would continue to guide her toward new horizons.